Davis McClendon was the kind of person everyone loved. A 46-year-old with a heart of gold, Davis was known for his warmth, kindness, and his ability to make anyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. For years, he had been a familiar face in Greenwood, South Carolina, someone who made a difference in the lives of those around him. From the residents at the retirement home where he worked to the friends he held close. His life took a new turn when he met Meredith Haney. It was just an ordinary night at a local bar when Davis struck up a conversation with her. It wasn't long before they hit it off, and within a matter of months, they were inseparable. Davis, a man who had been through the pain of a divorce, found joy again in the company of Meredith. In the 6 months that followed, Davis and Meredith shared a love that seemed to grow stronger every day. They enjoyed spontaneous weekend getaways, quiet moments together, and the kind of bond that most people spend a lifetime searching for. But it wasn't just the romantic side of things that made Davis special. His kindness, his caring nature, and his ability to listen made him a pillar of support for Meredith, especially after the challenges she faced in her own life. But little did anyone know, this picture-perfect romance was about to take a tragic and unexpected turn, one that would shatter the lives of those closest to Davis. It was May 7, 2023, when everything changed. What seemed like a routine night would soon lead to the horrific discovery of Davis McClendon's lifeless body on the side of a quiet road. How did he end up there? And was it truly an accident, or something far more sinister? Stay with us as we uncover the chilling details of Davis McClendon's untimely death and the shocking events that followed. The morning of May 7, 2023, began like any other in Greenwood, South Carolina, but what authorities would discover just after 1 a.m. would soon unravel a mystery that no one could have predicted. At first, it appeared to be just another car accident. A 911 call had reported a wreck, and first responders rushed to the scene, where they found Davis McClendon's car, a mangled BMW 5 Series, parked in the middle of the road. But what struck investigators as odd was the fact that Davis wasn't inside the car. Instead, his body was found nearly 50 feet away, lying in the middle of the road. As the first responders began to assess the situation, they quickly realized that the scene didn't add up. Davis's car was heavily damaged, but there was no sign of another vehicle that could have caused the crash. The airbags in the BMW had deployed, but the car appeared to have been hit by something, or someone, much harder than a simple fender bender. One of the first things investigator Patrick Durkin noticed was the damage to the car's fender. It wasn't just dented, it was torn back, like a tin can being ripped open. It was a sign that something more violent had taken place. And then there was the distance. The body was found a shocking 50 feet away from the wrecked car. How did Davis end up so far from the crash site? It didn't make sense. It looked like he had been struck while outside the car and then carried, possibly by another vehicle, to where he was ultimately found. Further investigation uncovered more strange clues: an oil slick on the road, footprints, and tire tracks that seemed to lead away from the scene. It was as if someone, or something, had left in a hurry. This wasn't just a random crash, this was the aftermath of a deliberate event. But who was responsible? As the investigation continued, authorities began to suspect that Davis hadn't just been hit by a passing car. They were looking at a potential hit and run, one that had been carefully staged to look like an accident. But even more chilling was the idea that someone had been watching him that night. But who would want to hurt Davis McClendon? As the authorities began piecing together Davis's final moments, they learned that Davis had been on the phone with his girlfriend, Meredith Haney, just moments before he disappeared. She later revealed that Davis had told her he was parked at the intersection of Avid Road and Saw Grass Place, and then, just like that, the call was cut off. Worried, Meredith immediately called her close friend, Megan McGovern, to help find Davis. When they arrived at the intersection, what they found left them in complete shock: Davis's lifeless body, lying in the road. The scene was haunting. Meredith and Megan stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. And yet, as the pieces began to fall into place, it was clear that Davis McClendon's death was no accident, it was murder. But who would be capable of such a thing? And what drove them to kill someone so beloved? Someone with no known enemies? Stay tuned as we continue the investigation into the mysterious death of Davis McClendon and the shocking revelations that followed. As investigators dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding Davis McClendon's death, they turned their attention to those closest to him, and the one person who seemed to be at the center of everything: Meredith Haney. Meredith, Davis's girlfriend, had been deeply involved in the investigation. She was the last person to hear from him before he disappeared that night. And her testimony would become crucial in understanding the tragic events that led to his death. Meredith had been separated from her husband, Bud Ackerman, for months before she met Davis. She had recently left a turbulent marriage with a man who, despite his charm, had grown increasingly aggressive and possessive. And now, that very same man seemed to be at the heart of Davis's death. Bud Ackerman, Meredith's estranged husband, had never taken kindly to the idea of her moving on. The end of their marriage had only fueled his anger. And as soon as he found out about her relationship with Davis, things started to spiral out of control. Meredith recalls how Bud became obsessed, trying to track her every move and exerting control over her life. Even from a distance, the situation only grew more intense. Meredith had become increasingly isolated as Bud's paranoia and rage took over. At times, she noticed strange things, like a pillow with a hole cut in it, and a general sense of unease. Despite this, she tried to move on with Davis, but her past was never far behind. Bud's behavior became erratic as the night of May 7th unfolded. Meredith, now in a relationship with Davis, had tried to keep things low-key. She didn't want to provoke Bud. But as the evening wore on, things took a darker turn. Meredith and Davis went out that night, unaware that Bud was already tracking their every move. In fact, just hours before Davis's death, Bud had been spotted at a local bar, watching as Davis and Meredith interacted. Meredith was on the phone with Davis that night when he told her he was going to meet Bud. The conversation ended abruptly, and she knew something was wrong. But she couldn't have known just how bad it would get. Davis had been caught in the middle of a deadly triangle, one that would soon spiral into tragedy. What Meredith didn't know was that Bud had been watching them, and he wasn't about to let Davis take his place in her life. And so, on that fateful night, with Meredith and Davis at the club, Bud began his search. He was determined to confront them, and he would stop at nothing to do so. It wasn't long before Bud's truck was seen leaving the club, and investigators would soon uncover a trail of evidence that would lead them straight to him. But what they found wasn't just a man who had lost control. It was a man who had planned something far worse than anyone could have imagined. As investigators pieced together the events leading up to Davis McClendon's death, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. What initially appeared to be a tragic accident was quickly unfolding into something far more sinister, a deliberate act that would leave everyone involved stunned and searching for answers. The first clue was the oil slick. It was unmistakable, leaving a trail that seemed to lead away from the crash site. This wasn't just an accident, this was evidence of something else. Investigators realized that the trail of oil wasn't random, it led them straight to Bud Ackerman. And it was a critical piece of evidence that would unlock the mystery of that night. Authorities followed the trail of oil, and it led them to an unexpected place, Bud Ackerman's parents' house. There, they discovered a white Ford F-250 pickup truck, parked in the driveway, with oil leaking from underneath it. The same truck Bud had been seen driving that night. It didn't stop there. Upon closer inspection, investigators noticed more telling signs: oil stains leading from the truck and a crack in the front of the vehicle. The evidence was mounting, and it became clear Bud's truck was the vehicle responsible for Davis's death. But Bud's story remained unchanged. He denied any involvement in Davis's death, insisting it was just a tragic accident. However, authorities had already begun connecting the dots between Bud's actions that night, his interactions with Meredith, and the evidence at the scene. Security footage and digital evidence, data from Bud's truck's infotainment system, provided a timeline of events that painted a damning picture. At 12:51 a.m., just minutes after Davis had called Meredith, Bud was seen leaving the Key West Club. From there, investigators traced his movements as he followed Davis and Meredith, tracking their every step. Surveillance footage showed Bud arriving at the club around 10:40 p.m. But it wasn't until just before 1 a.m. that things escalated. He was seen leaving the club, and investigators soon found that his truck had traveled the same roads where Davis had been moments before. What happened next was critical. Bud's truck followed the exact path that Davis had taken before his death. The oil trail left behind was clear proof that Bud's vehicle had struck Davis. But it wasn't just the oil, there was more. The physical evidence, including a crack in the truck's front grille, matched the damage found on the BMW Davis had been driving. Bud's truck had sideswiped Davis's car, hitting him with such force that Davis was carried across the road and left for dead. What followed was a frantic attempt to cover his tracks. Bud had no intention of calling for help, no intention of doing anything other than fleeing the scene. On the morning of May 7, 2023, just hours after Davis's body was found, Bud Ackerman was arrested. Authorities had gathered enough evidence to charge him with the murder of Davis McClendon. The arrest was a turning point in the investigation, but the question still lingered: why? As Bud Ackerman was taken into custody, the full extent of his actions began to unfold. His obsession with Meredith, his need for control, and his deep-seated rage had culminated in a deadly confrontation, one that ended in the tragic death of an innocent man. But while Bud's arrest marked a critical moment in the investigation, the answers to the questions of why and how would soon be revealed in court. As the case moved forward, investigators and the public alike would be forced to reckon with the depth of Bud's jealousy and the deadly lengths he would go to in order to maintain control over the woman he could not let go of. After months of investigation, the case against Bud Ackerman was finally set to go to trial. The evidence was clear, and the prosecution had built a strong case. But as the trial began, the focus shifted not only to the man who killed Davis McClendon but also to the woman at the center of it all, Meredith Haney. Meredith had spent the past several months living in fear, knowing that her estranged husband, the man who had once been the love of her life, was now responsible for the death of the man she had hoped to build a future with. The trial was not just a search for justice for Davis, it was a journey toward understanding the dark depths of jealousy, obsession, and control that had led to this tragic outcome. The defense, however, argued that Davis's death had been an accident. Bud Ackerman's attorney claimed that he had not intended to kill Davis, suggesting that the crash had occurred without any malicious intent. They painted a picture of a man who had been overcome with emotion and anger, but not one who had premeditated murder. But the prosecution had a different story. They presented an airtight case, one backed by overwhelming evidence. From the oil trail leading from the scene of the crime to the digital data from Bud's truck, it was clear that Bud had intentionally struck Davis with his vehicle. And as the prosecution made their closing arguments, they painted a portrait of a man driven by jealousy and rage, a man who was willing to kill to maintain control over his wife, even if it meant taking the life of an innocent person. The jury deliberated for hours, weighing the evidence and the arguments presented by both sides. And then, finally, the verdict came. Bud Ackerman was found guilty of the murder of Davis McClendon. The courtroom erupted in emotion as the verdict was read. For Meredith, it was the moment she had been waiting for: justice for Davis, the man who had been taken from her far too soon. But even in this moment of victory, there was no joy, just the overwhelming weight of loss. But even as the legal system did its part, the emotional toll on Meredith was far from over. The woman who had once dreamed of a future with Davis was left to pick up the pieces of her life. Haunted by the tragic events that had unfolded, Davis McClendon will always be remembered as the kind-hearted, empathetic man who touched the lives of everyone he met. A man who loved deeply, lived fully, and whose life was taken too soon by a man consumed by jealousy and rage. But for Meredith, the memory of Davis will remain with her forever, a painful reminder of what could have been. As for Bud Ackerman, he now faces the consequences of his actions. Sentenced to life in prison, his once ordinary life shattered by his own obsession and violence. For Meredith, though, the journey toward healing will be long, but she takes solace in knowing that justice has been served. Davis McClendon may no longer be with us, but his legacy will live on in the hearts of those who loved him. And while the truth of that fateful night is now known, the pain of his loss will remain, a reminder of the deadly consequences of unchecked jealousy, obsession, and violence.